All right, so it looks like everyone's here and we just got to go ahead. Let's go ahead and call the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Elizabeth Smiley. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. These should remain off until trial ends. You should also make sure that your video is set to hide all non-video participants. This means that the only people on the screen right now should be me and both of our advocates. Can the attorneys at this point go ahead and make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Appearances for the government. My name is Samuel Gross. I'm here today with my second chair, Ms. Kinsey Clark, who will be running the tech for the government. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I represent the defendant, Kara Bassett, in today's trial. I'm joined by my co-counsel, Ms. Elizabeth Grant, and you won't be able to see or hear Ms. Grant throughout the course of today's trial. She'll just be off screen helping me with the technological components of the case.
All right, sounds good. All right, so do we have any pretrial matters before opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. From the government, just a few housekeeping matters.
Go ahead.
To start with, we wanted to talk quickly about this online format that we're doing today and just ask the court for two quick notes. One thing, the government's office, such as it is located on a highway. So we'd ask that if there's any loud banging or sirens going past the window that's disrupting or otherwise obstreperous, that we just pause the time until that passes by. Is that all right with the bench?
Is that all right with defense counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, we'll go ahead and do that.
Now, we also understand, Your Honor, that in this online format, we've been given permission to publish things to the jury. Because we're online, it's probably going to be harder to point with my finger to those. So we'd ask for the court's permission for my second chair to just use her cursor and lay it next to where we might be reading from so that the jury can understand where to direct their attention.
That's fine.
Next, Your Honor, we wanted to move through a couple of things of substance, starting by drawing the bench to the trial order, if you have it in front of you.
Give me 1 second. I have it. I just got to get the right tab open. Okay.
Starting with pretrial order 6, noting that once exhibits are admitted, counsel can, on opening or closing or cross-examination, display them without permission from the bench. That was one we wanted to draw attention to.
Okay.
We also wanted to draw attention to pretrial order number 7. That indicates that exhibits 4 through 33 are pre-admitted and may be used at any time for any purpose. So they're already on the record, Your Honor.
All right, defense counsel, is that your understanding as well?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
All right, anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. We last wanted to draw the attention on the pretrial order to number 9 that says while the defendant is in trial today, she won't be testifying and won't necessarily be visible, so the prosecution is waived of its requirement to identify the defendant in trial.
Understood.
Last, Your Honor, we wanted to invoke Rule 615, which calls for the constructive sequestration of witnesses, except party representatives. And our party representative today will be FBI Agent Johnson on behalf of the government.
All right. Defense, do you have any party representatives?
No, Your Honor.
That's all from the government, Your Honor. We're ready to go.
All right. Any pretrial matters from the defense?
Same with the defense, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to hear opening statements from each party. So everyone needs to make sure that they're in speaker view. That's the button in the upper right corner of your screen. And attorneys, remember to please mute your audio while the other attorney is presenting.
Yes, Your Honor. Opening for the government.
Yes, whenever you're ready.
May it please the court, Ms. Bianchi, members of the jury. She wanted the money, but not the marriage. Today's case is a case about a defendant, Kara Bassett, who was willing to do whatever it takes to get what she wanted, even if that meant killing her husband. So I want to start today by telling you a little bit about the defendant. See, for most of her life, she wasn't very wealthy, but she did have big dreams. She loved wild animals, and she knew she wanted to work with them for a living one day. Today you're going to learn that the defendant took a big step towards realizing that dream when she met her first husband, Don. Ms. Clark, can we get a picture of Don up on the screen? Thank you. This is Don Clark. He met the defendant in 2009 and they fell in love. So you're going to hear that Don checked a lot of boxes for the defendant. He made her feel valuable. He bought her a lot of gifts. He indulged her passion for wild animals. And members of the jury, he was rich. He had over $8 million in assets. Ms. Clark, you can take down the picture of Don now. Today you're going to learn that with her husband's help, the defendant was able to build her own private zoo. It was a dream. But pretty soon the defendant learned that being married to Don Clark didn't solve all her problems. See, you're going to hear that in today's trial, Don Clark was careful to keep his assets separate from his wife's, to keep control of his money to himself. And so that started to make the defendant angry. And then in February of 2017, the defendant fell in love with someone else, a man who would one day become her second husband, Hugh Bassett. Members of the jury, Hugh Bassett was the one she wanted to be with. And so she had a problem. She wanted Don's money. But she didn't want the marriage anymore. And you're going to hear today that she got what she wanted, because the evidence is going to show that on May of 2017, she got what's called power of attorney, which means that if her first husband were to die, she'd get to take control of all of his assets. And then, just 2 months later, her husband did disappear. And a year after that, to the day, she married her second husband and took control of all of Don's assets as soon as the law would allow. Folks, it's Don's death that brings us to court today. See, as the government in today's trial, we've charged the defendant with murder. And that means we need to show you, the members of the jury, two things. First, that Miss Bassett killed her husband. And second, that she did it intentionally. We're going to prove that to you when we call our witness, FBI Agent Johnson, to the stand. Now, Agent Johnson is going to walk you through how this crime took place. And he's going to start by saying that on the day that Miss Bassett's husband went missing, something else went missing too. A vial of highly dangerous, tightly controlled animal tranquilizer. Then he's going to show you physical evidence that proves that the defendant took her husband's body, loaded it into a back of a truck, drove 139 miles, and dumped that body into the swamp. But that's not all. You're also going to hear about the suspicious circumstances following the defendant's husband's disappearance. You're going to hear that she waited a week to report him missing. When she did, she told the FBI that she spent that week searching for her husband. But you're going to see the defendant's phone records in court today, and when you do, you're going to notice that in the entire week when she was supposedly searching for her husband, she didn't send him a single text or give him a single call to ask where he was. Folks, that's because she already knew where he was. It's because she had killed him. She wanted the money, but not the marriage. And that's why we're going to ask you to find her guilty. Thank you.
All right, defense opening statement.
They saw what they wanted to see. On August 18th of 2017, Don Clark was managing a situation that the prosecution, in their opening statement, quite simply didn't tell you about. 2:52 p.m. Don Clark tells his wife that he wants to talk about Costa Rica. 6 p.m. Don Clark receives a series of text messages from an unlisted Costa Rican phone number, demanding that they talk urgently. Pale white, panicked, Don Clark gets on the phone with that Costa Rican number, and they speak for almost an hour. And then, hours later that same day, he vanishes. You'll discover today that we still don't know who was behind that phone. We don't know. The FBI doesn't know. The US government doesn't know. And you'll learn that that's going to be a problem for the government in today's case. Because in today's murder trial, you'll learn how the FBI, time and time again, failed to follow on leads, failed to ask the necessary questions. They saw what they wanted to see, and they couldn't be bothered to look anywhere else. Good afternoon. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I represent Kara Bassett in today's trial. And now the government has charged Miss Bassett with first-degree murder, and it's their burden alone, to prove that she committed this crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And you see, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the highest burden in our criminal justice system. The prosecution has to prove each and every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And you'll learn today, they won't be able to. Miss Bassett, she came into court today presumed innocent. And she stays that way, unless they can prove otherwise. In the government's opening statement, they told you that this case, it centers around a loveless marriage, a syringe, and a phone. Well, you'll learn today that marriage, the government isn't going to call any witness that is intimately familiar with the relationship that Miss Bassett had with her husband. Instead, we're going to call Joe Kwong, a documentarian who worked with the couple and lived on the park for a number of years, filming them for a documentary. Joe Kwong will testify as to the loving bond between these two people, not to any loveless marriage. And that syringe? You'll learn that a syringe was kept in a locked equipment unit that multiple employees had access to, not just Miss Bassett. And the government? They're not going to call any of those employees who had access to syringes like this one. And the phone records that Mr. Rhodes talked about. The only thing those phone records are going to show is that my client's phone never left her house on the night her husband died. And members of the jury, this behavior by the government, it's a pattern. You'll learn that it isn't just the evidence they want you to focus on that has serious issues. It's also the fact that they ignored evidence entirely, evidence you will hear today. You'll hear of thousands of hours of footage that were unwatched, witnesses who were never interviewed. You'll learn that Don Clark, well, he essentially had a second life in Costa Rica. I mean, fancy cars, vacation homes, large sums of untraceable cash. And the government knew all of this, but they failed to investigate it. Instead, today, you'll hear from us what those text messages and where that call came from. You'll learn it came from Costa Rica, and that hours after that phone call, Don Clark disappeared. The FBI, the government, they made a choice. They saw what they wanted to see, and they didn't look into any other reasonable possibilities. That's why, at the end of today's trial, will come before you and ask you to find the only just verdict, not guilty. Thank you.
All right, so before the government calls its first witness, I'm going to ask everybody to switch back to gallery view. That's the button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and this will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. If the government is ready, go ahead and start.
Yes, Your Honor. Prosecution calls FBI agent Steph Johnson.
All right, Ms. Johnson, we will assume that you have been previously sworn. You may begin your questioning whenever you see fit.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the members of the jury, please, ma'am?
Sure. Hello, my name is Steph Johnson, and I'm an agent with the FBI.
What is your background with the FBI?
I began my work in the FBI as a special agent back in 2003, and I've worked on over 100 cases during my time there. Things like murder, serial murder, kidnapping, things of that sort.
Can you tell us about your involvement in today's case?
I received a call to investigate the disappearance of a Mr. Don Clark from Tallahassee, Florida. I later ruled this case to be a homicide.
Oh, ma'am, who is Don Clark?
He was a local man of the Tallahassee area who owned a private zoo.
Did he live alone?
No, he lived with his wife, Kara Bassett, who was Kara Clark at the time of his disappearance.
Ma'am, you said the time of his disappearance. When was that exactly? Can you be more specific?
Well, according to his wife, he disappeared around August 18th, 2017, but we didn't receive the missing persons call until about a week later, on August 25th.
When the FBI gets a call about a missing person, what's the first thing that you do with a case like that?
Well, we immediately go to the area to search for a body. That's the first thing I did, and when I canvassed, we didn't find anything. Assuming that doesn't work out, one of the first things we do after that is we look into the finances of the missing person. That usually ends up being a big factor.
Now, you said the finances of Mr. Clark. Was he a wealthy man?
He was very wealthy. I learned that he had assets valued around $8 million.
So how did you go about looking into those finances?
Oh, we got in touch with his attorney.
Ms. Clark, can you go ahead and put Exhibit 4 already in evidence on the screen, please? What are we looking at here?
This is a letter addressed to me from Mr. Clark's attorney, Mandy Tuminelli. She's describing what she knows about the case.
Okay, so let's walk through what she knows about the case together. Let's start with the paragraph that begins May 1st. Ms. Clark, let's zoom in on that, please. Agent, does this paragraph show what would happen if Ms. Clark disappeared? I'm sorry, pardon me, the February 2011. Does it show what happens about the assets of Mr. Clark and his family? My mistake.
Well, this informs me that first, the defendant had significantly less assets and less income than her husband did. And it also informs me that they kept their assets separate.
Let's move over to that paragraph May 1st now. Ma'am, did this paragraph say what would happen if Mr. Clark disappeared?
Well, Ms. Bassett had executed a power of attorney clause. That means that if her husband were to suddenly disappear or die, she was to obtain all of his assets.
Now, Agent, this is important. Do you know when she got that power of attorney?
Well, she executed it on May 1st of 2017, and that was just a few months before Mr. Clark disappeared.
Okay, last paragraph in that letter. Let's move over to the one that begins June 17th, please. Ma'am, in this paragraph, did you find any evidence that Miss Clark and Miss Bassett's marriage was in trouble?
I did. We found evidence that Mr. Clark had filed an injunction for a restraining order against the defendant.
Would you recognize a copy of that?
I would.
Agent, do you have Exhibit 34 in front of you?
I do.
What is that?
This is a petition for injunction for protection against domestic violence that was filed by Mr. Clark.
Does it appear to be fair and accurate?
It does.
Your Honor, we move Exhibit 34 into evidence.
Objection, Your Honor. More prejudicial than probative.
All right, response?
Your Honor, may I make an offer of proof?
You may.
Your Honor, what we expect this document to show is that the victim in today's case filed a restraining order claiming his wife, he was afraid she would kill him just months before the attack. Now that's highly probative. Opposing counsel's objecting under 403. That rule only bars evidence that has unfair prejudice to the members of the jury. There's no prejudice to this document. It's highly probative.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
We have a good faith belief that this injunction was denied. It was never set into practice. Therefore, in order to delve into the statements in the injunction would be more prejudicial than probative, as they were not deemed true. They were denied.
Response?
Last response.
Well, Your Honor, we disagree with Ms. Bianchi that the reason this was denied was because the statements weren't deemed true. We believe we have a good faith basis to believe it was because of a clerical error. But setting that aside, the fact that a few months before this attack, he had expressed fears that his wife would kill him is highly probative, and opposing counsel's objection goes to weight and not admissibility.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd move my objection to improper character evidence. May I be heard?
Briefly.
Your Honor, Mr. Gross just told us that they're using this document to show that because Don Clark may have been afraid that his wife would hurt him in the past, that she would act violently in the future. And that's improper character evidence.
Response?
One response, yes.
Your Honor, there's no character evidence in this document. What it's going to show is that he had a fear for his life, and he was so concerned about it that he moved to file a temporary restraining order.
All right, I'm going to overrule the objection on character evidence. And as for the 403, I think it's a close call. Leave it up to the jury to decide, how they take this evidence. You can cross-examine on the fact that it was denied. So overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Clark, let's go ahead and put up 34, please. Agent, let's go ahead and zoom in on the blue section at the end that he wrote, please. Agent, what does this tell us about Mr. Clark's relationship with his wife? What does he say?
Well, Mr. Clark writes here that this is the second time that Kara has gotten angry enough to threaten to kill me. And he later goes on to say that he's afraid that the defendant is going to kill him in his sleep.
Okay, Ms. Clark, let's take that down, please. So, Agent, having seen that letter from the attorney and this application for a restraining order, what did you do?
I immediately obtained a warrant and I searched the defendant's property.
What'd you find?
I found a large supply of highly toxic carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer.
Well, why did that stick out to you?
Well, you see, that's a controlled substance. It's very lethal and it's very dangerous. So we immediately looked to the zoo's records to see how much of that controlled substance they had on hand.
Did those zoo's records indicate how much they should have had on hand?
Yes, I learned from a logbook that was maintained by the zoo that they were supposed to have 24 vials.
How many did you count that day?
I only counted 23.
Agent, is one vial enough to kill a human being?
Yes, 10 times over. Just a very small amount of carfentanil can kill an adult human.
Did you find any bodies on the premise that had been tranquilized?
No.
Did you find any way that a body could be transported away from the premises?
Well, we did find several hairs that matched Mr. Clark on the floor of the back of the van.
Was there any way that you could tell where this van you found might have been used, if it was used to transport a body, where it would have gone?
Well, it was a van that was maintained by the residents and it had automatic GPS tracking enabled. So I was able to analyze those records.
Ms. Clark, let's put up Exhibit 31, please. Agent, what is this?
This is the GPS records that I was able to obtain from the van.
Okay, let's walk through it. Ms. Clark, starting with Section 2. What does this segment show, Agent?
It shows that on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, that van was driven from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park all the way to the Big Gum Swamp.
How far away is that swamp?
It's 139 miles.
Ms. Clark, let's switch to Segment 4. What does this segment show us, Agent?
Well, about a half hour after the van arrived at the Big Gum Swamp, it was driven all the way back to Tallahassee and left at an airstrip that was just a few miles near the zoo.
All right, thanks, Ms. Clark. Let's take down the exhibit. What did you do with this GPS information?
Well, the fact that the van was taken to the swamp was actually pretty helpful to my investigation.
How so?
Well, we ran some forensic testing, and we found that algae from the swamp actually has a pretty unique form. It's a very rare form of algae that's unique in itself.
Were you able to test whether that algae appeared on other surfaces in this case?
Yes, I ran testing on some items, and we were able to find this unique form of algae in 2 different places.
What are those 2 places, Agent?
Well, the first one was pretty obvious. The algae was found all over the van that had traveled to the swamp. And the second was a little less obvious. We found it on the bottom of a pair of boots that were found at the zoo.
Who did those boots belong to?
The defendant informed me that they were hers.
Did you ask the defendant about that?
Of course, and she denied ever having been to that swamp.
So what did you do?
Well, at that point, we were highly suspicious of the defendant, but we were waiting to see what her next move would be.
What'd she do?
Well, the next August, she had her husband legally declared dead.
Did you do anything else?
Well, we found that a year later, the defendant had legally declared her husband dead, and she obtained all of his assets.
What did you do at that point?
We arrested the defendant for the murder of her husband.
Now, Agent, on direct examination, opposing counsel mentioned something about mysterious people from Costa Rica. Did you find any evidence that that syringe we looked at was accessed by someone other than zoo personnel?
No. I learned through my investigation that only 4 individuals had access to those syringes, the defendant, Mr. Clark, and 2 of the park employees. I didn't find any evidence that anyone from Costa Rica had the motive or the means to murder Mr. Clark.
What about the van that was driven to the swamp? Do you find any fingerprints in that van that weren't able to match to someone from the zoo?
No, I found fingerprints that matched the defendant.
Thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions.
All right, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Agent.
Good afternoon.
Let's start by talking about what you talked about on direct examination, starting with those syringes. Ms. Grant, could we get a copy of Exhibit 18 on the screen, please? Now, Agent, this is a photograph of one of the elephant tranquilizers you found, right?
Correct.
This is not the missing elephant tranquilizer, right?
No, because it's missing.
That's right. We have no idea where that one elephant tranquilizer is.
We don't know exactly where it is, but I do know that only a limited amount of people had the keys to access those syringes.
So you don't know whose fingerprints are on the missing syringe, right?
No, because it's missing.
You don't know if the missing syringe is in Costa Rica.
No.
You do know that multiple people had access to this syringe, like you mentioned before, right?
Well, the defendant, her husband, and the park employees.
That's right. There were multiple park employees that had checked out multiple syringes in the past. Isn't that true?
Correct, but the logbook indicated the last time one of the syringes was checked out, and it was in early August.
And that logbook, it didn't account for that missing syringe, right?
It did not.
All right. Let's move on to talking about this algae and the van that you mentioned on direct examination, all right? Just to be clear, there is no GPS evidence that Miss Bassett went to Big Gum Swamp, correct?
Well, there's evidence that the van from the residence traveled from the zoo to the swamp.
That wasn't my question, Agent. I asked whether or not there's GPS evidence that puts Miss Bassett at Big Gum Swamp, and there's not, right?
No, you can't GPS track a human, but you can GPS track a van.
Well, you do know that her cell phone never pinged any cell towers near Big Gum Swamp, right?
It didn't ping any cellular towers, but again, it's entirely possible that she could have left her phone at home.
So that's a no. It didn't ping any cell towers near Big Gum Swamp, right?
No.
And this algae, you don't know exactly how it gets transferred to other places, right?
Not necessarily.
You don't know if the algae found at Big Gum Swamp is also present at Great Tallahassee Elephant Park, do you?
Well, let me be clear. The algae that was recovered from the Big Gum Swamp is a very rare and unique form of algae. It's highly unlikely that it would match any samples of algae that could have been at the residence.
Agent, I didn't ask you whether or not it was rare. I asked if you tested other areas for the same algae, and you did, right?
No, I didn't feel the need to because the algae from the swamp was such a rare and unique form.
So you didn't feel the need to check whether or not this same algae was at the elephant park?
We didn't check that.
You didn't feel the need to check whether or not this same algae was at nearby swamps or parks?
No, again, this algae that we recovered is unique to the Big Gum Swamp.
Okay, Agent, let's talk about some of the individuals you weren't able to interview in today's case. There were certain individuals who worked at the park that you weren't able to find an alibi from, right?
That's correct.
Along with his ex-wife, Lisa Clark.
We weren't able to provide an alibi for Ms. Clark. However, throughout my investigation, there was no evidence that suggested she had access to the syringes or the van.
Agent, did you interview a Joe Kwong?
No, ma'am.
So you didn't interview someone named Joe Kwong. Did I hear that correctly?
No, ma'am.
You knew from Miss Bassett's interrogation that Joe Kwong was a documentarian working on the park. Isn't that true?
Yes, he was covering a documentary about Miss Bassett.
And Miss Bassett told you herself that Joe Kwong was filming her for months. Isn't that true?
Yes, I believed he had been filming for a period of years.
That's right. And you never asked Joe Kwong for any of the footage from years of the park?
I didn't directly, but let me be clear, Mr. Kwong was interviewed by one of my fellow agents.
Agent, were you ever able to view the footage that Joe Kwong had years of?
No, we weren't able to access that footage.
So are you familiar with any video evidence in today's case?
Not from the documentary, no, but we did check cameras at the residence, and there wasn't any video footage that yielded any significance to my investigation.
But just to be clear, none from the documentary, right?
No, ma'am.
All right. Agent, let's move on and talk about what you know about the victim's connection to Costa Rica, all right? You pulled up a letter earlier on direct examination with Mr. Gross from his attorney, Ms. Tuminelli, right?
Correct.
And in that letter, it was clear that Mr. Clark had vacation homes in Costa Rica, right?
Yes, he had properties and assets overseas.
That's right. He was even looking to transfer large sums of cash to Costa Rica in the months before his disappearance.
That's what the letter from the attorney noted, yes.
And that transaction wasn't able to occur because he went missing.
Yes.
Agent, isn't it true that Don Clark was in communication with someone from Costa Rica on the day that he went missing?
Yes. When I analyzed the phone records of Mr. Clark, I found that he had a 52-minute call at 6 p.m. on the night he disappeared. But when I looked into that call, it yielded no evidence that was of significance to my investigation.
Well, Agent, let's talk about that a little bit more. Ms. Grant, would you mind pulling up Exhibit 21, Mr. Clark's phone records? It's already in evidence. Now, Agent, you'd agree with me that at 6 p.m. on August 18th of 2017, Don Clark received 2 text messages from an unlisted Costa Rican number, right?
Yes.
They say, "Call me immediately" in Spanish.
Yes.
That same minute, Don Clark gets on the phone with the same unlisted Costa Rican number, right?
Yes.
They speak for almost an hour.
52 minutes.
You just told us that you looked into that call, Agent. Isn't it true you still don't know who that number belongs to?
No, because it was an unlisted number. However, I did look into the connections that Mr. Clark had to Costa Rica, and this yielded nothing of significance for my investigation.
But Agent, you weren't able to connect this number with any of those people in Costa Rica, right?
No, ma'am.
So you don't know whether or not this person was part of the cash transactions that Mr. Clark wanted to initiate before he went missing, right?
I don't know that information.
You don't know whether or not this person was accounted for his disappearance, do you?
No.
And lastly, Agent, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the nature of today's case. You agree that your investigation was originally a missing persons case, right?
It was.
And then it shifted to a homicide investigation, right?
Yes, Miss Bassett declared her husband legally dead a year after she was able to, since he had been missing for a year.
Agent, we don't have a murder weapon in evidence today, do we?
No.
And Agent, isn't it true that you were never able to find Mr. Clark's body?
Well, we weren't able to recover the body because the swamp that the van was driven to, which supposedly had the body in it, it was dumped in the swamp, and that swamp is known for having a lot of alligators and thick marsh.
Once again, Agent, you weren't able to recover Mr. Clark's body, right?
We were not.
Thank you. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
All right, any redirect for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Now, Agent, opposing counsel just got up here and asked you some questions about unlisted numbers from Costa Rica. Did you find any evidence that there was someone from Costa Rica hanging around the zoo at the time of the disappearance?
No, absolutely not. After I conducted my investigation, spoke to all the witnesses, searched the park, and recovered all of the evidence that I did, I found that the totality of the evidence pointed solely to the defendant.
Thank you. We have nothing further.
All right, Agent Johnson, thank you for your time today, and we will move to the defense's witness, correct? All right, go ahead whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
At this time, the defense calls Joe Kwong to the stand.
All right, Mr. Kwong, you have previously been sworn. Counsel, you may begin your questioning whenever.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello there. My name is Joe Kwong.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Kwong?
Well, I'm mainly a producer. I like to say that I work with the silver screen. I make films, I watch vibes, and I turn them into art.
How are you involved in today's case as a filmmaker?
Well, I was actually hired by the folks that own a zoo out in Tallahassee to come on and film some of the things that they had going on and try and produce a documentary film about the zoo.
Who hired you for that project?
A woman named Cara Bassett, she contacted me and said that she was one of the people in charge and that she wanted me to document everything that they had going on.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your relationship with Miss Bassett. When did you first meet?
It would have had to be in 2015 is when they first contacted me. It didn't take very long for us to figure out the terms of payment and how long I'd be on and everything like that. And I immediately got to filming.
And does your relationship with Miss Bassett influence your testimony at all today?
Of course not. I'm a filmmaker and a producer first. I work on making movies honestly and with integrity.
Well, Mr. Kwong, did you ever see Miss Bassett's husband interact?
Yes, a number of times. They were married. They were with each other quite a bit, and it seemed like a pretty normal marriage. They were pretty nice to each other.
How would you describe their relationship?
Well, like I said, it was pretty normal. You know, they talked a lot. They hung out a lot. They seemed really loving.
Mr. Kwong, given your proximity to the park and being there for many years, are you familiar with a storage unit on its premises?
Yes, I believe so. We came across it a few times in filming. It was always locked up.
Do you know what, if anything, was kept in that locked storage unit?
Yes, I believe so. I believe it were like supplies for the zoo, things like medical supplies.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, the witness just testified that he came across this storage locker several times, and each time it was locked. So at this point, asking this witness what he knows about what's contained within it lacks foundation. We haven't heard he's seen it.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. It's in the record that Mr. Kwong was on the premises and familiar with the unit. I believe that he testified that he was familiar with what was inside, although it may have been locked in the times that he'd seen it, but I'd be happy to further clarify with the witness if he ever saw it unlocked.
Let's go ahead and clarify that.
Mr. Kwong, you told us you're familiar with this storage unit. Did you ever see it unlocked?
A number of times, yes. I filmed almost everything that I could when I was at the zoo at all times that I was there. There were a number of times where people needed to go into the supplies to get things.
I want to talk to you about one of those supplies in particular, elephant tranquilizers. Are you familiar with those?
I mean, as much as I can be. I've seen them before, yes, but I'm not like a veterinarian or anything.
Ms. Grant, would you pull up Exhibit 18? What is this, Mr. Kwong?
Oh, that is one of the syringes, I believe, that they were
I'm
using.
sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Kwong. Calls for improper opinion. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, we just heard from the witness that he's not exactly familiar with what exactly this elephant tranquilizer might or might not be. So opposing counsel can certainly ask him what this looks like. But because he's not a veterinarian and because he doesn't know, she can't ask him what it is. And that's the question that's on the record.
So what's your objection?
Your Honor, objection is to lack of personal knowledge.
Okay. Response?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Kwong just told us that he's actually seen this image before and seen syringes just like this for years on the park premises. I'm asking him if he was aware of what the image was and just to give a little context as to his familiarity with it.
Response?
That's okay. I'm not sure that we have enough foundation for him to talk about what exactly is in this syringe. It's for anybody without.
Your Honor, if I may clarify.
Syringe. You have one more shot, but go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. First off, this exhibit is already in evidence. And furthermore, I'm not going to be asking the witness what is inside the syringe, just whether or not he's seen a syringe like this filled before.
Response?
Response, go ahead.
Your Honor, if the question is only what this looks like and whether he's seen something like it before, we'd be all right with that. But the question right now is, what is this? And we believe there's a lack of foundation and lack of personal knowledge on that front.
Ms. Bianchi, are you willing to change your question to the question you just mentioned?
Sure. I think we need the statement of what is this to categorize whether or not he lacks the personal knowledge, but I'd be happy to be more direct.
All right, let's be more direct. So sustained.
Mr. Kwong, have you ever seen syringes filled like this before?
Yes, I've seen these syringe that looks like this probably 20 or so times used at the park for the elephants.
Who did you see have access to syringes like this from that unit?
They're mostly just employees from the park, people like Kara. There are a couple other employees like Yale. I believe Sam also had a couple.
All right, Mr. Kwong, let's move to talking about your last interaction with the victim, Don Clark. When was the last time you talked to him?
It would have had to been late August of 2017, like August 18th.
What were you two doing?
Well, we were just talking about a trip that I was taking to Mexico, but then he suddenly stopped and kind of walked away.
What happened?
Well, we were talking about my trip, and he was saying that he was going to see me later, and then suddenly he got a text message and just walked away. He looked so afraid. His face, it drained of color, and he seemed terrified.
Was this the last time you saw Don Clark?
Yeah, as he stormed off without a word, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him.
What time do you remember him receiving that text message?
I had just been finishing up with filming a segment, and so it had to have been around 6 or so.
Is that 6 p.m., Mr. Kwong, just to be certain?
Yes, ma'am, about 6 p.m.
Ms. Grant, could you pull up Exhibit 21, please? It's already in evidence. Mr. Kwong, have you seen this document before?
Yes, I believe I was shown this before.
Were you shown it in your interview?
Yes.
You just told us that Mr. Clark received a text message at 6 p.m. on the day he went missing, August 18th of 2017.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you see anything on here that corroborates a text message received at 6 p.m. on that day?
Yes, there are 2 instances here for messages received at 6 p.m. on that day.
And where did those messages come from?
It says unlisted.
May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, our objection is to a lack of foundation at this point. The witness can't testify as to where those numbers came from. He can only testify as to where those numbers were registered. They were registered as an unlisted number in San Jose, Costa Rica, but we don't know where they were calling from.
What was your exact question again, Ms. Bianchi?
Could you tell us where those 6 p.m. messages came from?
Okay, what's your response?
Your Honor, frankly, in the question, I'm simply asking him to put onto the record what's already in evidence, reading that this unlisted number from Costa Rica is what sent the message. If Mr. Gross would like me to ask what registered phone number is to the message, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, let's clarify it a little bit and be a little bit more specific. So sustained.
Mr. Kwong, you just told us that there are 2 messages here that were received at 6 p.m.
Yes.
What registered phone numbers are connected with these text messages?
It looks like the same exact number is registered for both, a 506 number ending in the 4448. And they're both next to unlisted San Jose, Costa Rica.
Mr. Kwong, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about Costa Rica. Are you aware of Mr. Clark having any connections to Costa Rica?
Yes, actually. I believe he owned a vacation home there.
Have you ever been to Costa Rica?
I actually have, yes.
Why'd you go?
Well, with everything going on and with everything that Don had said, I thought things might have been a little suspicious, so I wanted to look into it myself. And so I went to go visit Costa Rica on my own and see if I could find Don.
Did you find anything?
Well, not really. I didn't find anybody. And people seemed to recognize him, but nobody could tell me anything.
Objection, Your Honor. It's to hearsay. May I be heard?
Yes, you may.
As to the people seem to recognize him, Your Honor, we have a good faith basis to believe that that can only be ascertained based on someone's statement that they might have recognized him, in which case it's certainly being asserted for its truth, that there were people in Costa Rica who recognized Don.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, there was no statement being elicited. There's no statement an out-of-court statement being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. This is from the witness's perspective. He went to Costa Rica physically and saw people, went to the house that was owned by Mr. Clark, and nobody seemed to recognize him.
A response to that?
Sure.
Your Honor, the issue here is with the witness's testimony that people seem to recognize Don Clark. As the court's aware, a statement of identification is just that, a statement. And it's hearsay.
Based on that objection, I'm going to overrule. It could be based on hearsay statements, or he could have shown them a picture and they could have, to him, looked like they recognized the person in the picture. We don't know what it's based on. So just given your objection, I'm going to overrule.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Kwong, you just told us that you'd gone to Costa Rica. Did you take any footage when you were there?
No, not really. Nothing.
Did you tell the FBI in today's case that you had gone to Costa Rica?
Well, I mean, I kind of tried. They didn't really ask me anything.
Thank you, Mr. Kwong. No further questions at this time.
All right, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, before we proceed with cross-examination, permission to read a portion of a transcript of one of the defendant's FBI interviews onto the record. It's been stipulated as authentic.
Hence, any objections?
Not at this time, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead and.
Yes, Your Honor. For opposing counsel's reference, I'm looking at Exhibit 3, page 12, starting at line 23. Question. Who is Hugh Bassett? Answer. Defendant. My current husband. Question. When did you and Hugh get married? Answer from defendant. August 18th, 2018. Question. When did you and Hugh Bassett begin a romantic relationship? Answer from defendant. Early 2018, we met at a fundraiser for elephant preservation and hit it off. Good afternoon, Mr. Kwong.
Good afternoon, sir.
Mr. Kwong, you just heard me read the defendant claim that she met Hugh Bassett at a fundraiser in 2018, right?
No, sir, that's not what I heard you say.
Said that she met him at a fundraiser in 2018, right?
No, it didn't. It said
That's
that
when they began their romantic relationship, wasn't it?
well, it said that that's when they began their romantic relationship. I don't think she said anything about when they met, just that it was at the elephant fundraiser.
Well, you know that she actually met him months before her first husband went missing, right?
Yes, I believe I saw Hugh during my filming.
He'd come by the park, wouldn't he?
Yes.
That was a few times in, what was it, February and March?
I would say so, sir, yes, early 2017.
When you saw him, you'd say he looked like he was a snappy dresser, right?
Yeah, he dressed really nicely. He really carried himself well. Nice guy.
Said he was pretty handsome too, wasn't he?
I guess you could say so. I mean, I don't know.
And the defendant definitely noticed him at the property, didn't she?
Well, yeah, they were working together.
Well, since her first husband has disappeared, the defendant has married that man, Hugh Bassett, right?
Yes, Hugh is her current husband, yes.
You've watched the two of them together in a relationship.
Yeah, Hugh was really there for her after Dawn disappeared. He was pretty much the only shoulder she had to cry on.
That's right, you'd say they're very close.
Well, now, yes, they're married.
You'd say their relationship is very good, right?
Well, yes, sir, they're married now.
Let's talk about her first marriage with Don Clark. It's true that when you first met them, Don Clark, he was pretty doting on his wife, right?
I guess you could say that.
They were very affectionate with each other?
Yes, they were not, I wouldn't say lovey-dovey, but they were very caring about each other. They were very thoughtful.
But then in 2017, they started to argue from time to time, right?
Well, I wouldn't classify it like that. Whenever they talked about the elephants, it turned into an argument, but it wasn't from time to time. It was just whenever they were going over logs and things like that.
Well, you watched them shouting at each other several times, right?
Yes, they would sometimes shout at each other about the elephants.
And each time you got them on film shouting at each other, the defendant asked you to delete that film, right?
Well, yeah, they always asked me to delete anything that was too private, anything that, you know, they wouldn't want the public to be into, because the documentary was about the zoo. It wasn't quite about Kara. It wasn't quite about Dawn. It was about what they were doing. And so anything that got too personal, it didn't need to be on the record.
I understand, Mr. Kwong. So that's a yes? She asked you to delete the footage?
Well, yes, it was something that we both agreed on.
Let's talk a little bit more about the defendant and the circumstances surrounding her first husband's disappearance. Now, he went missing in August of 2017, right?
I believe so. I believe that's what I was told, yes.
Now, opposing counsel asked you some questions about numbers that were registered in Costa Rica. Sir, it's true, you didn't see anyone around the zoo accessing a storage locker who wasn't a zoo employee, right?
No, I don't suppose so.
You didn't see anyone who wasn't a zoo employee access the zoo's van, right?
No, I never saw anybody doing that.
Now, at the time that the defendant's husband went missing, some people thought, you thought that he might have gone to Costa Rica, that's right?
Well, that's what I thought. He frequents there to his vacation home. He told me he was going to see me in a couple of weeks when I got back. I just assumed, yeah.
Sure, so you went to Costa Rica to check that out, didn't you?
Well, yeah, everything that had come out so far just didn't sit right with me, because that just didn't seem like who Don was.
Let's talk about what you found. When you got there, you found his home empty, right?
Yes.
The lights were off?
Yes.
You went inside, you saw the fridge was empty?
Yes.
Saw there were no toiletries anywhere in the house?
No, there weren't any that I saw.
You stayed in Costa Rica for a week after that point, that's right?
Correct.
Visited the home several times, didn't you?
Well, I only did it once that extensively, one time extensively where I went inside, but I did go by a couple more times, yes.
Well, sure. On those couple more times, you never saw anyone near that house, right?
No, I never saw anybody near the house.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what the defendant might have been doing around the time that her husband disappeared. We're going to take a look at those phone records Ms. Bianchi showed you on direct examination and see what we can make of them together.
Okay.
Ms. Clark, can you put up those phone records Ms. Bianchi used, please? You told us on direct examination you recognize this, right?
Yes, I believe I was shown this in one of my interviews.
It's a listing of phone calls, isn't
Yes.
it? Now, we agree that the defendant's husband went missing on August of 2018, right?
That's just what I was told.
Let's take a look at the first page of this document. That's phone calls that the defendant made on the week that her husband went missing. I'm going to ask Ms. Clark to put a box around the phone calls that happened after he went missing. Do you see that, sir?
Yes, I do.
We can agree that that box goes around the phone calls after her husband went missing, right?
Is this the only page of the document, sir?
This is the only page of calls, sir.
Yes, then yes.
None of the calls that the defendant placed were to the defendant's husband, were they?
No, they seem to all be to super soups.
And that lines up with what you saw in person, doesn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
In the
There
week.
was.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Were you finished with your answer?
Oh no, I was just saying I believe so. There were a few times where I wasn't with her, but as far as I saw, yeah.
As far as you saw, she never tried to call her husband, right?
Not that I know of.
Okay, let's go ahead and skip over to the text messages, Ms. Clark. That's the second page. Do the same thing. We'll put a box around all of the text messages that she sent after her husband's disappearance. Sir, we can agree that this box selects all of the, I'm sorry, Ms. Clark, it looks like we skipped forward a little much. Tech troubles and woes. Sir, the box we're looking at now shows all of those texts that were sent after her husband's disappearance, right?
But if that's what's here, then yes.
Sir, let's look at the owner column of that. None of the numbers that she texted were registered to Don Clark, right?
No, not that I can see. I see there's a Lisa Clark there, but I don't see Don's name.
So she didn't text a number registered to Don Clark saying, "Where are you?" That's not on here, is it?
No, it seems like the only text messages she sent to Don.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
As to what?
As to what Miss Bassett may have written her husband. Going from just saying there isn't a text message to saying what a text message might have included is speculative.
Okay, response?
Response, Your Honor, we're asking what's not reflected on the document. This is stipulated to be an authentic record of the text messages that she sent in that week, and we're asking that this record doesn't show a text message saying, "Where are you?"
I think if the question is limited to what is reflected or not reflected in the document, then it's all right. So I'll overrule the objection.
Yes,
Yes,
sir. Sir, it's true that this document doesn't reflect a text message being sent saying, "Where are you?" right?
Well, it does at the top. It says to Don Clark, "Where are you?"
I'm sorry, sir, I should have clarified. In the yellow box after the disappearance, that's not there, is it?
No, I don't see anything else.
All right, Ms. Clark, we could go ahead and take that down now. Sir, after her husband's disappearance, a few months later, Ms. Clark took control of the business, right?
Yes, I believe so. After Don was gone, there wasn't anybody else to run things, and only Kara knew how things were done.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
No redirect examination, Your Honor. We just ask the witness be allowed to step down.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kwong. You are now free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, so we will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Also, since both witnesses has completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballot. Did we lose our prosecution attorney? I don't see
I
him.
apologize. I apologize, Your Honor. I had to blow my nose.
Got it. All right. So we will give everybody a second to switch to speaker view and then to complete the witness portion. All right. You may begin your closing arguments whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. All right. May I proceed? May it please the court, Ms. Bianchi, members of the jury, throughout today's trial, there's just one thought that's been sticking in my head. And it's just how well things kind of worked out for Miss Bassett in the end, didn't they? Just how well the timeline lines up with her interests. Now, we haven't had a very long trial today. It's only been about an hour, but nonetheless, you've been asked to remember lots of names, dates, things about animals. So for a second, I just want to walk through the timeline of what happened from the defendant's perspective. I think that's going to make things simpler. I think what we're going to see is that she wanted the money, but not the marriage. Ms. Clark, can you go ahead and pull up that timeline, please? Thank you. See, this case started in February 2011. That's when the defendant married Dawn Clark. We heard from Mr. Kwong for the start. They were happy. But then we heard from Mr. Kwong that in 2017, things weren't going so well. They were starting to argue each other about business. Then in February of 2017, the defendant met the man of her dreams, Hugh Bassett. But the problem for the defendant was that she couldn't divorce her current husband to marry Hugh without losing all that money. And then we heard that in May of 2017, that problem went away when she got what's called power of attorney, meaning that if her husband were to die, she'd keep control of all of his assets. Folks, just 2 months later, he disappeared on August 18th. Fulfilling the terms of that power of attorney. And in the next week, the defendant behaves rather suspiciously because we heard that her husband went missing on August 18th. Then a whole week went by before she reported him missing. And in that entire week, we saw that she didn't send a single text or give a single phone call to her husband asking where she was. Then, in October of 2017, she takes control of the business. 3 months after that, she starts dating Hugh. In August of 2018, we heard that she has her husband declared dead exactly 1 year after he was declared missing, as soon as the law would allow. And then on that same day to celebrate, she married Hugh Bassett with all of Dawn's money in her bank account now. Folks, she got the money. She got out of the marriage. And that's motive for murder, plain and simple. Ms. Clark, we could go ahead and take down that chart right now. But as if that motive wasn't enough, one of the most important documents in today's case comes from Mr. Clark's own voice. Because, folks, he wasn't blind. He knew that there was something up. And we saw a restraining order application that he applied for. Ms. Clark, let's get 34 on the screen. Remember what he said just months before he disappeared. I'm afraid that she is going to kill me in my sleep. This is the second time that she's threatened to kill me. Ms. Clark, we can take that down. Folks, think about how concerned you would have to be about your spouse trying to kill you in order to go to the police and file for a restraining order. But as if that's not enough, then we show you physical evidence. We heard from FBI agent Johnson that there was a syringe of a deadly animal tranquilizer that went missing. And then we heard that the defendant's hair follicles were found in the back of a van that on the night of his disappearance was driven 139 miles to a swamp. And opposing counsel wants you to believe that that van might have been driven by someone suspicious from Costa Rica. But folks, look at the defense's own witness. The defense's own witness, he said he never saw anyone who wasn't a park employee access that van. The defense wants you to believe that that syringe that went missing from someone in Costa Rica. Maybe it's hanging out in Costa Rica somewhere. But that doesn't line up with the facts either. Because we've heard from the defense's own witness and the government's FBI agent that that case of syringes was locked. And it only was accessible to park employees. Members of the jury, that's all the physical evidence in today's case, except maybe the most important part, and that's the mud on the defendant's boots. Because today we heard that there was a very specific kind of mud at the swamp where the body might have been dumped. And we heard that that mud matched the mud that was collected from the defendant's shoes. The FBI agent told you it was very specific. Now, of course, there are all sorts of ways we might be able to explain that. Maybe the defendant had visited that swamp. And that might be true, except for the fact that when the FBI agents asked her about it, she denied it flat out. She said, there's no way I've ever been to that swamp. Members of the jury, her shoes prove otherwise. Opposing counsel, Ms. Bianchi, got up here today and she asked you to believe that it might have been someone from Costa Rica. But we haven't heard any evidence that he was ever in Costa Rica. We haven't heard any evidence that someone from Costa Rica accessed the park. We haven't heard any evidence that anyone from Costa Rica accessed that van. Members of the jury, when it comes down to it, a story that is not reasonable does not provide reasonable doubt. She wanted the money, but not the marriage. She killed her husband to get it. That's why we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
All right, defense closing arguments.
Yes, Your Honor. They saw what they wanted to see. Members of the jury, it's been 3 years. 3 years. And what the prosecution offered you today was testimony of an investigation that failed. Failed to look into all possible leads, failed to ask all necessary questions, failed to conduct a thorough algae test. This is the United States government. They have access to the FBI, its labs, its analysts. And in today's murder trial, they haven't brought you enough. They needed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And instead of doing that, the prosecution ignored evidence that hurt their case. And now, it isn't enough. Innocent. Cara Bassett started today's trial presumed innocent, and she remains innocent unless they prove otherwise. It's the job of the United States government and the United States government alone that has to prove that she committed murder in the first degree with malice aforethought. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The highest burden in our criminal justice system. So ask yourselves, have they met it? Let's walk through some key evidence that the prosecution relied on today. They tried to tell you that my client's motive for killing her husband was a loveless marriage. But where was evidence of that? The government didn't call a single witness that had intimate knowledge of the relationship between Miss Bassett and her husband, and instead, we did. Joe Kwong took the stand and told you that for years of filming them, interacting with them on a daily basis, he had nothing to say, that it was a loving relationship and they were affectionate with each other. And remember Mr. Gross on cross-examination, he tried to get Mr. Kwong to say, oh, but Miss Bassett met Hugh years before. Miss Bassett left her husband for Hugh. That's not what Mr. Kwong said. And as soon as Mr. Kwong started to offer a clarification, They brushed right through it. The way they've been brushing through pieces of evidence this entire investigation. The prosecution also claimed that a syringe was used to kill Mr. Clark, but you heard from the agent herself. We don't know where that syringe is. We don't know where that missing syringe is, and we can agree there's one missing from the log, but we don't know whether it was Miss Bassett, whether it was another employee, whether one went missing when it was being shipped. We have no idea what happened. They can't say that just because the syringe was at the park, that someone at the park took it, that someone at the park, more specifically Miss Bassett, used it to kill her husband, when we have no idea if this drug was in his body at all. Because we didn't find the body, and we don't know what killed him. They also relied on this evidence of algae and a van. Members of the jury, what did we hear about the algae today? Because Mr. Gross came up here in his closing argument and told you that's what did it. That's what connected Miss Bassett to the crime. The agent told you otherwise. Told you that there isn't any GPS evidence that brings her to Big Gum Swamp. And even with that algae evidence, we have no way of knowing whether or not she acquired that algae from the swamp or not. Because Miss Johnson told you herself that she didn't think it was necessary to test other natural substances. Didn't need to test the dirt or water at the elephant park. Didn't need to test nearby swamps or other parks, because she knew Miss Bassett had done it. Members of the jury, the prosecution can't be allowed to say there aren't any other reasonable explanations for how that algae got there when they didn't ask the questions. And they told you themselves. They didn't look. Members of the jury, this evidence, this investigation, it's incomplete. After 3 years, it's incomplete. And there is no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that my client drugged her husband with an elephant tranquilizer, put his body into a van, drove it across the state of Florida. There's no proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and instead we have questions. Because at the beginning of today's trial, we told you that it's not just the evidence they presented and wanted you to focus on that had issues. It's the evidence they chose to fully eliminate. That's why we keep bringing back Costa Rica. We know that Don Clark pretty much had a second life in Costa Rica. The government admitted, Agent Johnson admitted, she knew he had wire transfers, money being sent to Costa Rica, fancy cars, vacation homes. His attorney knew that he wanted to liquidate large assets in the United States and move it to Costa Rica. But instead of investigating Costa Rica, instead of finding out who that unlisted phone number was, they told you it didn't matter. Members of the jury, that's not how justice works. And the prosecution can't be allowed to say that person in Costa Rica doesn't exist or doesn't matter just because they didn't look. And now, members of the jury, we're not saying that it was some mysterious Costa Rican drug cartel that killed Don Clark. No, we're not. We're saying that evidence of his connection to Costa Rica, particularly on the day he went missing, and the concerning events that happened in the hours before his disappearance, it requires further investigation. Investigation that the agent didn't conduct. Investigation that we don't have. Evidence that we can't judge. And because of that, they have not met their burden. They saw what they wanted to see. But you don't have to. See, members of the jury, you get to look at all of the evidence. Get to assess it when you go back to the jury room to deliberate, and you get to decide what justice means. Justice for Mr. Clark, justice for Ms. Bassett, justice for the investigation as a whole. Don't ignore the gaps in their case. Don't ignore evidence that was missed. Find Ms. Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Is there a rebuttal from the prosecution?
Yes, Your Honor.
Whenever you're ready.
Members of the jury, this case doesn't stop with the disappearance of Dawn Clark, because we need to look at what the defendant did afterwards. A whole week passes by. The world around her is looking for her husband. At the end of that week, she calls the FBI, but what happened in the middle? She didn't call him. She didn't text him. She didn't say, where are you? How are you doing? Are you safe? That's because she didn't want him to be safe. She already had what she wanted. She wanted the money, but not the marriage. Members of the jury, the mud, the syringe, the restraining order, evidence like this doesn't pile up against innocent people. Find her guilty. Thank you.
All right, so we have concluded closing arguments. Judges, please complete your ballots and then click submit. Make sure you stay on the Zoom until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we'll do some brief comments.